Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming together to join together in the fellowship of Torah so that we can immerse ourselves both in the words and deeds and relationships of Torah, so that we can dive into this wonderful, rich text that is both written before us and that we are writing ourselves the next chapters by the way we relate to one another. So we are in Parshat Chukat, which is in the book of Numbers, and it begins in chapter 19. We'll be starting at verse 1. If you have a Chumash, you can turn to book of Numbers, chapter 19. And if you'd like to go ahead and at this point, unmute, and together we can recite our blessing for this opportunity of sharing study with one another. We say our blessing. Baruch
atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah.
Thank you, God, for this opportunity to immerse ourselves in words, deeds, and relationships of Torah. So we will read through the entire English translation of our Torah portion. I'll start off reading a few verses, and then I'll invite other people to have an opportunity to read some verses as well. And then at the conclusion, I'll share with you a little bit of a focus study that I prepared, and then we'll open it up for everyone to have an opportunity to share his or her reflections and responses to this week's Torah portion. So book of Numbers, chapter 19, verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, "This is the ritual law that Adonai has commanded. Instruct the Israelite people to bring you a red cow without blemish, in which there is no defect and on which no yoke has been laid. You shall give it to Eleazar the priest. It shall be taken outside the camp and slaughtered in his presence. Eleazar the priest shall take some of its blood with his finger and sprinkle it 7 times toward the front of the tent of meeting. The cow shall be burned in his sight, its hide, flesh, and blood shall be burned, its dung included. And the priest shall take cedar wood, hyssop, and crimson stuff, and throw them into the fire, consuming the cow." We're now at verse 7 of chapter 19. Richard, would you like to read a little bit there?
Yes.
And Hannah, would you like to help?
Yeah. For the same book.
I'm going to take this one.
Yes.
The priest shall wash his garments and bathe his body in water. After the priest may re-enter the camp, but he shall be unclean until evening. He who performed the burning shall also wash his garments in water, bathe his body in water, and be unclean until evening. A man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the cow and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place to be kept for the water of lustration for the Israelite community. It is for cleansing. He who gathers up the ashes of the cow shall also wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. This shall be a permanent law for the Israelites and for the strangers who reside among them. He who touches the corpse of any human being shall be unclean for 7 days. Such a one shall cleanse himself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and then be clean. If he fails to cleanse himself on the 3rd and 7th day, he shall not be clean. Whoever touches a corpse, the body of a person who has died, and does not cleanse himself, defiles the Lord's tabernacle. That person shall be cut off from Israel. Since the water of lustration was not dashed on him, he remains unclean. His uncleanness is still upon him.
Thank you, Richard. And with either...
Which verse are we on?
So we are now on verse 14 of chapter 19.
Oh, verse 15.
Yeah.
That's 1146. This is the procedure. When a person dies in a tent, whoever enters the tent and whoever is in the tent shall be unclean 7 days. And every open vessel with no lid fastened down shall be unclean. And in the open, anyone who touches a person who was killed or who died naturally, or human bone, or a grave, shall be unclean 7 days. Some of the ashes from the fire of cleansing shall be taken for the unclean person, and fresh water shall be added to them in a vessel. A person who is clean shall take hyssop and dip it in the water and sprinkle on the tent and on all the vessels and the people who were there, or on him who touched the bone, or the person who was killed or died naturally or the grave. The clean person shall sprinkle it upon the unclean person on the third day and on the seventh day, thus cleansing him by the seventh day. He shall then wash his clothes and bathe in water, and at nightfall he shall be clean. If anyone who has become unclean fails to cleanse himself, that person shall be cut off from the congregation, for he has defiled the Lord's sanctuary. The water of lustration was not dashed on him. He is unclean.
Thank you, Anna. Zippy, would you like to read a little bit at beginning of verse 21?
21 here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That shall be for them a law for all time. Further, he who sprinkled the water of lustration shall wash his clothes, and whoever touches the water of lustration shall be unclean until evening. Whatever that unclean person touches shall be unclean, and the person who touches him shall be unclean until evening.
Thank you, Zippy. We're now moving to chapter 20 of Book of Numbers. So let me invite June. Would you like to read a little bit beginning at the very start of chapter 20?
Thank you, Rabbi. And the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month. And the people abode in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. And there was no water for the congregation. And they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people strove with Moses and spoke, saying, would that we had perished when our brethren perished before the Lord. And why have ye brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, to die there, we and our cattle? And wherefore have ye made us to come up out of Egypt, to bring us unto this evil place? It is no place of seed, or of figs, or of vines, or of pomegranates, neither is there any water to drink. And Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly unto the door of the tent of meeting, and fell upon their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared unto them. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, take the rod and assemble the congregation, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, that it give forth its water. And thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock. So thou shalt give the congregation and their cattle drink.
Thank you so much, Jude. Dave, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 9?
I would. Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron assembled the congregation in front of the rock, and he said to them, listen, you rebels, shall we get water for you out of this rock? And Moses raised his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod. Out came copious water, and the community and their beasts drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you do not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity in the sight of the Israelite people, therefore you shall not lead this congregation into the land that I have given them. Those are the waters of Meribah, meaning that the Israelites quarreled with the Lord. The Israelites quarreled with the Lord, through which he affirmed his sanctity.
Thank you so much, Dave. Let me invite Ruth. Would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 14?
Yes, thank you, Rabbi. From Kadesh, Moses sent messengers to the kingdom of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardships that have befallen us, that our ancestors went down to Egypt, that we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and that the Egyptians dealt harshly with us and our ancestors. We cried to the Eternal, who heard our plea, sending a messenger who freed us from Egypt. Now we are in Kadesh, the town on the border of your territory. Allow us then to cross your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, and we will not drink water from wells. We will follow the king's highway, turning off neither to the right nor to the left until we have crossed your territory.
Thank you, Ruth. Steve, would you like to read a little bit beginning of verse 18?
But Edom answered him, "You shall not pass through us, else we will go out against you with the sword. We will keep to the beaten track," the Israelites said to them. "And if we or our cattle drink your water, we will pay for it. We only ask for a passage on foot. It is but a small matter." But they replied, "You shall not pass through." And Edom went out against them in heavy force, strongly armed. So Edom would not let Israel cross their territory, and Israel turned away from them. Setting out from Kadesh, the Israelites arrived in a body at Mount Or. At Mount Or, on the boundary of the land of Edom, the Eternal One said to Moses and Aaron, "Let Aaron be gathered to his kin. He is not to enter the land that I have assigned to the Israelite people, because you disobeyed my command about the waters of Meribah. Take Aaron and his son Eleazar and bring them up to Mount Or. Strip Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar. There Aaron shall be gathered unto the dead."
Thank you so much, Steve. And Margot, would you like to read beginning at verse 27?
Yes, happy to. Moses did as the Lord had commanded. They ascended Mount Hor in the sight of the whole community. Moses stripped Aaron of his vestments and put them on his son Eleazar, and Aaron died there on the summit of the mountain. Oh, that's stupid. When Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain, the whole community knew that Aaron had breathed his last. All the house of Israel bewailed Aaron for 30 days.
Thank you, Margot. And Cheryl, would you like to read beginning at the start of chapter 21?
Thank you, Rabbi. When the Canaanite king of Arad, who dwelled in the Negev, learned that Israel was coming by the way of Atharim, he engaged Israel in battle and took some of them captive. Then Israel made a vow to Adonai and said, "If you deliver this people into our hand, we will proscribe their towns." Adonai heeded Israel's plea and delivered up the Canaanites, and they and their cities were proscribed. So that place was named Hormah. You want me to go on?
Thank you very much. I'm going to invite someone else to read. Thank you so much, Cheryl. Gary, would you like to read next? They're beginning at verse 4.
They set out from Mount Hor by way of Sea of Reeds to skirt the land of Edom. But the people grew restive on the journey, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. "Why do you make us leave Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no bread, there is no water, and we have come to loathe this miserable food." The Eternal sent seraph serpents against the people. They bit the people, and many of the Israelites died. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned by speaking against the Eternal and against you. Intercede with the Eternal to take away the serpents from us." And Moses interceded for the people. Then the Eternal One said to Moses, "Make a seraph figure and mount it on a standard, and anyone who is bitten and then looks at it shall recover." Moses made a copper serpent and mounted it on the standard. And when bitten by a serpent, anyone who looked at the copper serpent would recover.
Thank you, Gary. And Peggy and Jim, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 10?
Yes, thank you. The Israelites marched on and encamped at Oboth. They set out from Oboth and encamped at Abarim in the wilderness bordering on Moab to the east. From there, they set out and encamped at the Wadi Zered. From there, they set out and encamped beyond the Arnon, that is, in the wilderness that extends from the territory of the Amorites. For the Arnon is the boundary of Moab, between Moab and the Amorites. Therefore, the book of the wars of Adonai speaks of, Wahab in Sapah, and the wadis, the Arnon with its tributary wadis, stretched along the settled country of Ar, hugging the territory of Moab. Go ahead, Jim.
And from there to Beer, which is the well where Adonai said to Moses, assemble the people that I may give them water. Then Israel sang this song. Spring up, O well, sing to it. The well which the chieftains dug, which the nobles of the people started, with maces with their own staffs. And from Midbar to Madana, and Madana to Nahaliel, and from Nahaliel to Bamoth, and from Bamoth to this valley. That is the country of Moab, at the peak of Pisgah, overlooking the wasteland.
Thank you both so much. Let me invite Paul. Would you like to read beginning at verse 21? And you'll need to unmute, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Israel sent emissaries to Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, let me pass through your land. We shall not turn off to field or vineyard. We shall not drink well water. On the king's road shall we travel until we pass through your border. But Sihon did not permit Israel to pass through his border. And Sihon assembled his entire people and went outside against Israel to the wilderness. He arrived at Yahaz and waged war against Israel. Israel smote him with the edge of the sword and took possession of his land, from Arnon to Yabok, to the children of Ammon. For the border of the children of Ammon was powerful. Israel took all these cities, and Israel settled in all the Amorite cities, in Heshbon and its suburbs.
Thank you so much, Paul. Jay Lenson, would you like to read a little bit, beginning at verse 26? There you go. Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Now Heshbon was the city of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who had fought against a former king of Moab and taken all his land from him as far as the Arnon. Therefore the bards would recite, come to Heshbon, it is built firm. Sihon's city is well founded. For fire went forth from Heshbon, flame from Sihon's city, consuming Ar of Moab. The lords of Bamoth by the Arnon, woe to you, O Moab. You are undone, O people of Shemash. His sons are rendered fugitive, and his daughters captive by an Amorite king, Sihon. Yet we have cast them down utterly, Heshbon along with Dibon. We have wrought desolation at Nopah, which is hard by Medeba.
Thank you so much, Jay. Justin, would you like to read a little bit beginning at verse 31?
Thank you, Rabbi. Israel settled in the land of the Amorites. Moses sent men to spy out Ja'azer, and they captured its villages, driving out the Amorites who lived there. Then they turned and headed north toward Bashan. Og, the king of Bashan, came out toward them with all his people to wage war at Edrei. The Lord said to Moses, do not fear him, for I have delivered him, his people and his land into your hand. You shall do to him as you did to Sihon, the king of the Amorites, who dwells in Heshbon. They smote him, his sons and all his people, until there was no survivor, and they took possession of his land.
And then we have just one verse left in our Torah portion. So Justin, could you just complete that verse 1 of chapter 22?
The children of Israel journeyed and encamped in the plains of Moab, across the Jordan from Jericho.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's our entire Torah portion from the week. I'd like to share with you a little bit of focus study, and then we'll open it up for everyone to share their responses and reflections on our weekly Torah portion. And for our little bit of focus study, I'd like to take a look at this incident that happens at the waters of Meribah, this moment when God calls upon Moses to speak to a rock to bring forth water from it. And if you look at, if you want to look at Numbers chapter 20, I'm going to be looking at verses 8 through 12, basically, to see some kind of key words that show up there. And so on the study sheet number 1, I note that God instructs Moses to, quote, bring water before their very eyes. So Moses is to do something before the very eyes of the Israelites and order the rock to yield its water. And so we know what happens is, rather than speaking to the rock, ordering the rock, what Moses does is what he did some time ago in trying to get water from a rock. He takes his staff and he hits the rock. And at this moment, Moses seems to be expressing a great deal of some kind of frustration, exasperation, irritation with the people. And he shouts out, "Listen, you rebels, what are we supposed to do? Get water from this rock for you?" In response to this entire episode by Moses, the text tells us that God then responds and says to Moses, "Because you did not trust me enough to affirm my sanctity before the eyes of the Israelite people, you will not be entering into the promised land." So I would like to focus, first of all, on this notion, which gets repeated, this concept of that Moses was supposed to do something before the eyes of the Israelite people. This is intended to be a visual experience. The Israelites are supposed to see something, and apparently that seeing something is a very important element of this moment at the rock, not just getting the water. And I have here in Hebrew the word that indicates, because you do not trust me, lo natan, sorry, me enough, because you did not trust me. So we're going to focus a little bit on that Hebrew word, because from that Hebrew word, we have the word emunah, which means faith, trust. So we're going to explore, first of all, what is the nature of faith or trust, and what's the relationship between faith and trust and this notion of having a visual experience. So I have here on the study sheet other words that evolve out of the same root word that we get emunah, this notion of faith or trust. So we have, it comes from the verb aman, to confirm, to support, or to nourish. We get emunah, firmness, steadfastness, fidelity. Interesting enough, in the second book of Kings, we have the same root giving us amanah, which is the name of a river flowing through Damascus. And the same root word also gives us the word for an artist, a master worker. So what is the relationship here between faith and visual and a river and an artist? That's what we're going to explore a little bit in this few moments of focused study. So I have in number 3 a little bit of an excerpt from a book by John Berger, who's a great art critic, and he has a book called Keeping a Rendezvous. And he writes this: "Every artist discovers that drawing, when it is an urgent activity, is a two-way process. To draw is not only to measure and put down, it is also to receive. When the intensity of looking reaches a certain degree, one becomes aware of an equally intense energy coming towards one through the appearance of whatever it is one is scrutinizing. The encounter is a ferocious and articulated dialogue. To sustain it requires faith. Now, what is the nature of faith that John Berger seems to be talking about? I think what he's getting at is that when an artist produces something, it's not merely the artist putting something out. The creation itself is speaking to the artist. And to endure that kind of a dialogue with what you're creating requires something that he calls faith. And it's interesting that our Hebrew here is in fact telling us that there is grammatically or etymologically a connection between being an artist and being someone of faith. Okay. He has another book called The Sense of Sight. And he writes, John Berger writes in that book, paintings are prophecies received from the past, prophecies about what the spectator is seeing in front of the painting at that moment. A visual image is always a comment on an absence. Visual images based on appearances always speak of disappearances. I'd like you to hold on to this notion that Berger here is now presenting to us, that a visual image is a comment on an absence, on something of what is no longer there. And I think the artist here that John Berger is presenting to us is someone who has, if you will, a contact with something that is intangible, something that speaks as much about an absence as a presence about something. And also, he's referring here about that the spectator is experiencing something in front of the painting, is receiving some kind of message about that absence. So we're going to explore over the next few minutes a body of work that focuses a lot on the fleetingness, the absence, memory, as even more than a depiction of what is actually there. So if you have a study sheet, you could turn it over, and we're going to look at some commentators on this body of work that we're going to identify in a moment. And our first commentator in number 5 is Paul Valéry, who was an early 20th century symbolist poet. And he once said, to see is to forget the name of the thing one sees. And I think what Valéry there is referring to is that to see is to go beyond the defined object that is in front of you. And it's to apprehend possibilities that expand beyond the objective framed presence that's before you, that there's something more there. And then we have Stéphane Mallarmé, who was a French poet. He was a contemporary of the French Impressionists. And he wrote, paint not the thing, but the effect it produces. And this goes very much to the very heart of what the whole Impressionist experiment was all about, which was to not paint an object, but to paint one's experience of what one has encountered. And that's captured here by the great Impressionist painter, Camilo Pizarro, who said, paint what you observe and you feel. So one of the great hallmarks of the Impressionist movement was a validation of the subjective experience of the painter. And so the subjective experience of the artist expressly becomes an element of the painting itself. Prior to the Impressionists, it was considered inappropriate for the artist to assert himself into the work, that one should not be able to see the hand, if you will, of the artist, that the artist's subjectivity was not the primary focus of a painting. It should be of an objective experience, if you will. And the Impressionists reject all this, and they introduce the notion about the importance of the artist's subjective experience of this moment that they are encountering. So if you turn back over, we have this painting by Claude Monet, which he painted, I believe it was late in his career, 1908, I think, San Giorgio Maggiore at dusk. So this is this cathedral that he witnesses, and it is full of these stunning colors. And you can see the notion of the objects that are there are vague and dissolving, and they have been replaced by, if you will, Monet's feeling at the moment. He fills it up with colors rather than the detail of line. And his wife, Alice, said, about this very painting and this very moment, it is so beautiful, we do not have any time to think of it. And that indeed is how the Impressionists painted. They didn't think about it a whole lot. They just reacted to what they were encountering and quickly tried to get it onto canvas. And in fact, this is why they were criticized by many of the art critics of the day, because they said, what they're doing, they're just mere sketches. These aren't real paintings. And their style is just too sloppy and too messy. You need to have precision. You need to have clarity. And of course, this is what the Impressionists rejected. And what the Impressionists were trying to capture, if you will, was a fleeting moment. The light would be such at one moment, and minutes later, the light would be very different. And they would just be trying to capture that moment, which would be no longer a few minutes later. So it was they were tapping into the fleeting, the ephemeral, and they captured that not only in what they looked at, which was nature and aspects of modernity that were expressing a very fast-paced society, but also the nature of light, of course. We'll see when we get past the Impressionists, we get to some of the post-Impressionists. Another aspect of what John Berger is talking about, is particularly with Seurat, the pointillist, who had a theory about if you put certain colors next to one another, then the viewer can, in effect, create the experience. It's not just up to the artist to convey an experience, but the viewer, by the way the viewer looks at these matching colors and how they butt up against one another, the viewer completes the painting experience, if you will. So the viewer becomes a participant in creating meaning out of this visual work. So in number 6, I just have a little bit of kind of concise description of what Monet's work is all about. Impressionism in general, and Monet's work in particular, is driven by the notion that sensory information registers on the retina prior to any recognition of the object. So that one looks at something, and before one even realizes exactly what it is, one is getting color information from that encounter. And Monet says, try to forget as an object what is before you. Absorb the color and the light impacts and paint it just as you experience it. So the Impressionists were dealing with a fleeting experience. They were dealing with sociologically what was becoming a very dynamic world where things were changing, things were moving very fast. The world didn't stay the same from one decade to the next, which was a very different human experience that had been going on for the previous hundreds of years. And so It was not just how they painted, but it was what they looked at and how they tried to portray it. And all of this, what the Impressionists were doing was a challenge to, and if you will, an overthrow of the existing artistic authorities, which were focusing on the permanent, the absolute, the unchanging. And the Impressionists were doing the complete opposite. They were experiencing a world that was fast changing, and they were noticing that there was a new class of people that were making the world different. And the world was being made different for them. And that was what we would call the bourgeoisie, the middle class, people that had a new kind of power in the world, who would now take trains, who would go on vacations, who would sit at coffee shops, who would go shopping. So these became, in many cases, the subjects of the Impressionists, which was a complete rejection, of course, of the more elitist subjects that the classical art would want artists to focus on. So I bring all this up because what's happening here at the Rock is a pivotal moment for the Israelite people. God, it seems, is encouraging Moses to have the Israelites have a visual experience that will somehow be transformative for them. And it's not just about the natural resource we call water. I think it's about something far more important and nourishing for their purpose of settling in the promised land. And we see that because what happens is Moses, we are aware of, yells out at the people, "Listen, you rebels." He strikes the rock. It is a disruptive moment. It is a moment in which Moses spoils this opportunity, if you will, for the people to gain something that they were supposed to gain from this moment. He blunts their opportunity to become participants. We have a mid and late 19th century Lithuanian rabbi, Naftali Zvi Yehuda Berlin, who wrote a great commentary called Ha'amek Devar, Delve into the Matter. And he wrote this about this moment. He says, this moment was to prepare the people for a post-miraculous new period, a transition from the miracles and direct intervention that occurred in the wilderness to the human work of study, prayer, and decision-making that is part of living in the land of promise. Rabbi Naftali is indicating that what's supposed to happen at this moment is the people are supposed to have this visual experience that enables them to see beyond the rock. They're supposed to see something that exists in potential, and that potential rests within them. It's supposed to be a moment when they become participants in the creation of a great work of art, the creation of a whole new nation. It seems that Moses, for whatever reason, frustrates and blunts this moment. He doesn't become the artist that allows them to become co-creators and therefore experience their own power. But despite that, our Torah portion hints that somehow the people overcome Moses's mishandling of this moment, and they come into their own power despite what Moses's failure at this moment. Where do we see that? Because we have another moment of seeking water, and that's in chapter 21. And God says, assemble the people that I may give them water. And then our text says, then Israel sang this song. Spring up, O well, sing to it, the well which the chieftains dug, which the nobles of the people started with maces with their own staffs. And then the amazing thing happens immediately after the people sing this song that brings forth water. It's in 2 verses later, in verse 21 of chapter 21, it says, Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites. Prior to this moment of the Israelites singing forth water, it was Moses that would send forth messengers to foreign kings explaining, we're crossing through your territory, don't attack us. After the Israelites exercise their power to bring forth water, it is the people then who send forth messengers to deal with these foreign powers. So this notion about a visual experience, what it means to have faith. To have faith is not a passive, submissive experience. According to our Hebrew and according to this bit of commentary, to have faith is a form of activism. It is a form of artistry. It is a form of seeing beyond the concrete object that's in front of you and seeing that more lies beyond it, that there are other possibilities, that there is an unseen presence, that there is an absence that's also being experienced in this moment. So to have faith is to be an activist. It is to be an artist. It is to be able to see beyond the obvious and the concrete, to see the possibilities that lie within the moment. So with that, I'd love to invite everyone to share your own thoughts, response, and reflections on what we've encountered during this chapter. I see, Susan, you've got your hand up. So go ahead and unmute.
So what occurred to me was that it wasn't even though Moses did it, but maybe because Moses did it. Because of Moses's failure, the people were able to come into their own. It's how we can learn too, is from the failure of Moses and Aaron is our tool for learning and embracing what we need to embrace. And here, Miriam's song, dance Miriam's dance and bring forth the waters.
So beautiful. So what also you make me recognize is what else is happening here in this chapter. Not only does Moses fail at this moment, but we have the complete collapse and departure of the leadership of the Jewish people. Miriam dies, Aaron dies, Moses is told he's not going forward. So we have that, how are the people going to respond to that crisis of leadership, that collapse? This bit of song gives us a little bit of hope. All right, thank you for that. And then Mark Thompson.
Rabbi, you distracted me in the very beginning, and I'll tell you what it was. You italicized before their very eyes and before the eyes. And it made me think, well, is God really concerned at this point about the impression that God is making on the people? Would he have accepted Moses' striking the rock if Moses had done this away from the people, if it had just been between God and Moses? And so then we're talking about what do we mean by faith? Is it okay to question our faith, but not in the presence of those that are needed to be influenced by God? And so this set me off in an entirely different direction. And I felt very sad because Moses didn't have an opportunity to express his anger in a way that maybe God would have accepted it if he hadn't done it before the people.
Thanks, Mark. It's clear, first of all, that God wants something to happen in front of everyone. Yes, the notion about doubt. Doubt is a driving element in faith, at least in the Jewish tradition. And so that can always be a powerful aspect of one's continuing to move forward, to have doubt and to be able to express doubt. How one does that is always a key question. So thank you for that, for pointing that out. Anna, did you have something you wanted to share?
Sure. Before their very eyes, order the rock to yield its waters, speak to the rock. And here I think is the seminal opportunity for the people of Israel and people of the world today, is that, like, let's talk to each other. Don't come up to me and say, listen, you rebel. No, don't point your staff, don't point your, you don't get someplace by hitting and fighting. You get someplace into the promised land, into peace and tranquility, into love, into relationship by speaking. And you don't speak and get in a relationship if you don't listen. So if God says, before their eyes, speak and let them look at what's happening. If you raise a stick, anybody's going to watch where that stick goes. If the stick is raised in anger, who is going to see the earth open, that very feminine opening and the water coming out while the big phallic stick is waving in the air? And I think that a great lesson is just not to throw the sticks around.
Thank you, Anna. And Richard.
I want to piggyback on what Anna said, because I've for long thought that this is all about the loss of Miriam, and that the order is to speak before the eyes of these people, show that you can solve problems by using your feminine energy to talk and discuss where you are, where we're going, and what we need to do as a group. And he's just sick of it, so he does the thing. And I want to try to link this to the red heifer.
Okay.
Go.
And, as you say, this is all about drawing and about water. And Moses was drawn from the water. So Moses, for me, is an allegorical figure. He doesn't even have a name. Moses just be drawn from. But in reality, there are really, and to the red heifer, there are two groups of people that we're talking about. One are the group of people that get unclean from touching something dead. The other is the group of people who administer the ritual. And there are two different mindsets. The people who are the object of the ritual, they get some water thrown on, they're a little bit released after 3 days, they feel a little bit better, and then 7 days later they've mulled it over or whatever, and they have, they're free now. But with the people who actually have to do the ritual and be involved, that's more like a meditation than a ritual for them. And it takes them all day to do this service, to give this ritual to people to mull over. And by the end of the day, they're exhausted, but they're clean by virtue of this.
No.
And I think that Moses did all that he could. And I agree that it was time for him to go. And what happened? Water, because he did what he did. So there you go.
Thank you, Richard. Okay. And others would like to share? Margot?
Well, going back to the text, the Israelite people were certainly a chore. And Moses behaved wonderfully in taking them, putting up with everything and every grumble. I mean, these were a miserable group of people. And he had one momentary lapse when he just couldn't take it anymore. One momentary lapse. And for this, he is punished. And it saddens me.
And you were also saddened, I heard, when you read that Aaron was
yeah, also Aaron, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. One momentary lapse, having put up with this awful group of people.
Yep, a lot is asked of leadership, and you're right. One public display of a misstep can bring the end of a career, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Right. And go ahead, Martine.
So tying back that one fleeting moment, back to Impressionism and art, I think that when you said the Impressionists capture a fleeting moment and then the light changes and it's an entirely different image, an entirely different picture that the artist would paint, that the person would see. And I'm glad you mentioned Seurat because he is my favorite artist. And because of his expertise with pointillism, that and the paintings are they're such a grand scale, they're huge. And depending on where you stand and how close you are, far enough away, and even sometimes like blink rate will change what I see in the image. And and it's the same thing with Moses. I don't blame him for being ticked off. Not only did his beloved sister just die, and the Israelites are being a pain in the butt, but last week he had this big rebellion against him. So I could see why he would get riled up and maybe lose his cool. But again, there's that one fleeting moment, and now suddenly he doesn't get to go into the promised land. And yes, it was building up and there are other things that he did, but this was kind of the last straw. And to me, that connects also to what you said in number 6 about the retina and looking at the way that your eye and your brain process visual stimuli, that the sensory organ, the retina, receives that light, and there are chemical changes that then go to electrical changes, go back to, or electrical signal go back to the occipital lobe in the back of the brain, where there's that initial processing, but then the connection has to be made through other parts of the brain, through the temporal lobe, for language, for labels, through the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and all of the, it really uses the whole brain to be able to put together a label to say, this is what I'm seeing, and to be able to describe and enunciate that. And I think that so goes together with the idea that up until now, the one single person who was, sending the messages and being the leader was Moses. And now suddenly we have, just like all of these different synaptic pathways are activated in the brain to put the picture together, we now have the Israelite people, the whole of Israel, the whole of the people who are now able to take charge, whether they want to or not, in connecting with the outside world, connecting with the leaders of other countries and other peoples, and also going forward into the land of Israel, where they're not going to be relying on just one person anymore.
So Martine, here's what you made me think of, because you talked about the different parts of the brain. Perhaps we could talk about it in terms of the scientific part of the brain and the aesthetic part of the brain. And one of the interesting things about the Impressionists is that they were perhaps the first artistic movement that was based in science. This was the beginning of color theory, where you had scientists who were trying to say something about relationships scientifically, about colors, and that's certainly what Seurat was all about. His was a scientific presentation of juxtapositions of certain colors. So we might think of this integration of the aesthetic point of view and the scientific point of view coming together at this moment in art history. And so I'm playing with these notions about the importance of having a complete integrative approach to life. And now I'm thinking about Moses. Poor Moses, because he may have been carrying with him all this time kind of an abiding sense of ambiguity about his identity and who he really was and where he belonged and what his real household was and so forth. And this notion about where he erupts, listen, you rebels, could just be a further eruption of that degree of ambiguity of that he's carrying around with him in terms of his identity with these people. He probably had, I hate to say it, but he might have had greater rapport with Pharaoh than with some of these Israelites. I mean, that's what because he was raised to be in effect another Pharaoh, right? And so he may have understood that language and that way of dealing with people and that kind of confrontation and dialogue than he does with the people that are seeking their way, seeking their water and so forth. So thank you very much for inspiring all that. All right. Other thoughts? Ruth, go ahead.
Well, thank you to Martine with such insight about the visuals of the painting. But I was looking at the painting, and it really is, it's very beautiful, and that's just on the screen. But I was looking at it, and it struck me, the impression of how there's what we think of as the delineation between object, background, environment is just sort of, one thing blurs into the next in such a beautiful way that you, like in the background, you see vague intimations or suggestions of more town, but there's just that vague suggestion emerging from the mist and the dusk and the sunset. So the idea that things are separate kind of gets blurred, and one thing blends into the next in such a beautiful way that what we think of as reality, like the heart or the book on the table or whatever, just kind of, those perceptions are changed by the painting. So it's very, I guess it was very modern then, and I guess it's very modern now in a way, because it makes us see things differently. And there's something else. Oh, the water. I was thinking about that beautiful water. If you think, when you look at the water, it's something moving. The water is moving, and it's capturing something where a nanosecond later it's going to shift. The water will move. The light. That's not fixed, but he's capturing something that in a nanosecond will have changed. So it's a beautiful painting. And like, I guess that's why we all love the Impressionists.
So Ruth, that's really beautiful. What you made me think of. It goes back to this one reference to Amanah, this river that flows through Damascus. And so this notion about faith is not static and it is not unchanging, that there's something fluid and dynamic to the notion of faith. And so I really thank you very much for kind of bringing that forward as well. Thank you. Any other, Anna, do you have something additional?
Yes,
yeah.
I was just looking at verse, 4 and 5. Why did you make us leave Egypt and bring us out here with some place where there's no grain, no figs, no vines, no pomegranates? If you just ever had to spend a few weeks in the desert with a whole bunch of people and no bathing, and it's dirty and dusty and gritty and hot and cold, I'd be griping. I mean, I think that's quite that's quite legitimate. But if you can have all of that, the irritation of this place that you were, and God gives you a picture of all of a sudden fresh, sweet water bubbling up out of a rock. How transformative just to watch. Why would you want to get in the way of that?
Thank you, Anna. That's very lovely. Thank you. And anyone else who hasn't had a chance, David, please share with us.
Well, I'm channeling my iconoclastic wicked son when I say God said to Moses, talk to the rock, tell the rock, order the rock to give water. But clearly, he's he's supposed to do something that can be seen by the Israelite people 400,000 or so out there, all the more reason to raise your rod up in the air so the people that can't hear you, even though you're screaming at the rebels, can see something dramatic happen and crack the rock with your rod.
So I guess
I agree with you, David.
I was backing you, Marco.
Middle school.
So that really gets to a lovely notion that we'll conclude with, which is, yes, some people go to as a default when asked to do something that people can see, that means doing something physical. There may be though a lesson that says, when you engage in some kind of discourse, perhaps there's something there to see as well that can be even more profound and empowering and instructive.
And eye-opening.
Go ahead, Richard.
I just want to tail end on this red heifer thing, that when he gets mad, he is not in a frame of mind to usher in the vision that God wants to provide for the people to see, would provide. What he shows is he's not ready for that. And he winds up, the legend has it that his soul still, after he died, his soul still marches ahead of the Israelites. So he didn't lose out altogether.
Thank you, Richard. So with that, I want to thank everyone for coming together. And I want to say that it's wonderful to come together every week with such a wonderful group of artists, artists who are devoted to making their own lives and the lives of the people around them works of beauty through the way we treat one another and the way that we seek social justice in this world. So thank you all very much for continuing to paint this beautiful picture of an ever brighter world. Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing all of you next week. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi, we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.